a permanent representative of Kenya, and now new, I don't know how new, but fairly new, recently appointed director of CIC. Welcome, and thank you for being with us. USG Nakamitsu, USG for Disarmament Affairs at the United Nations, and Joel Rosenthal, President of the Carnegie Council on Ethics and International Affairs. Again, thank you to all three of you for joining us. Today, we want to zoom out and really explore some of the issues that we've been discussing throughout the week. We've talked notably about the links between new technology and conflict. We've talked about the real potential for these new technologies to positively transform the human experience. But I think a number of participants also spoke to the risks, the inherent risks associated with that. We've talked about the loss of human agency. There were lots of discussions around autonomous lethal weapon systems. We've talked about the risks of centralizing economic and political power. We've talked about the malignant and malicious use of these new technologies. We've talked about the impact on mental health, on the well-being of societies and individuals as well. And so the intent of this panel is to see whether we can approach some of these issues from an ethical perspective, whether there are, if and how we can use ethical principles or sources of ethics to help us navigate these risks, manage these tensions. So that's the focus of the panel. In terms of process, I have two questions for all three of you, and then maybe if we have time, one specific question to each one of you. But I would really invite you to interject, interfere, respond to one another. We want to keep this a conversation. And if you allow me to manage time, because we want to make sure I'm sure a number of participants will have questions, and we do have a hard stop at 12 because Amandeep Singh is joining us from India, so it's getting late for him. Is that okay? Great. So and by the way, I want also to I'd be remiss if I didn't make a reference to Dak Amarkald for when we're doing a panel on ethics. I mean, we've been having these discussions throughout the week under his benevolent and caring gaze. And as you know, our second Secretary-General talked a lot about ethics, thought a lot about ethics, wrote a lot about ethics, and applied ethics or an ethical lens to his work. And I also mentioned Dak Amarkald because I'd like to start with you, Izumi. I want to let the audience know something about you, but I'm doing this because it's already in the public sphere. I don't know if you remember, but a few years ago, you were interviewed by the Dak Amarkald Foundation on questions of leadership. And you did mention that when you were appointed, you were asked by the Secretary-General to take your current post. You told him, disarmament, that's not really my background. And he said, that's right. That's why I want you to take the post, because you're going to explore these issues from multiple perspectives, including, I would assume, the ethical perspective. I don't know if you remember sharing that story. So this is why I'd like to start with you, and then Martin and Joel, please add as well with a fairly general question. But I think, and by the way, ethics has been brought up a few times throughout the week, but the first set of questions is around if and how we can use ethics to address some of these risks, manage the tensions, manage the rivalries, and if so, what does that look like? But also, some people have been questioning this naive, especially at a time when ethics itself might be contested, might be disputed, might be divisive as well, the reference to ethics. So is there, or what is the space for ethics from your perspective? Thank you.
Thank you. Before that, I should also add, when the Secretary-General asked me to take this position, and then, I told him I don't know anything about disarmament, he said exactly what you said, but also added twice, shake things up. So I take it shaking things up with different perspectives is part of my mandate given by the Secretary-General. Anyway, the ethics, I don't think it is naive. In fact, in all of our human history, you know, our international efforts has always been also guided by what you might call humanitarian concerns, but it is also ethical concerns, development of international law, including in disarmament and international security fields, has always had a very strong ethical components. So definitely it's not a naive proposition. In fact, it is a very important position. I say that disarmament has a couple of, if you will, origins. One is humanitarian and ethical considerations, and the whole development of international humanitarian law is definitely that. And then, of course, I was going to say, you know, your focus of this session is ethics, but when it comes to autonomous weapons use, there are other dimensions that we talk about, one of which is hardcore security considerations. I mean, you know, it poses a lot of security questions, you know, related to escalation control, etc. And then, of course, legal considerations, which is also very much linked to ethical considerations. So my first word is that it has actually been guiding principle of our international efforts in all of our field, including disarmament and international security.
Thank you very much. Martin, from your perspective, where do you see the space for ethics, especially amongst in the debates between member states? Or is it, as Izumi said, pure security matters or economic interests, or is there a space for exchanges from an ethical perspective when member states are discussing new technologies?
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure being here. Izumi, always good to be here with you and Joel. Great meeting you. I want to first, I think I distinguish between ethics and lawfulness. And when discussing institutions or states, I prefer to discuss law rather than ethics, and to think of ethics as an arena for individuals, perhaps individual leaders. Are you an ethical leader? Or are you a legal institution? Do you prosecute war legally and lawfully? And now, if you don't, then the ethics of those who work within the institution become critical. Do they have the character and the character that has the ethics and the bravery to stand with those ethics at a time when the institution that they're part of, whether it's a military or the state or the entire state, is bent on illegalities, and perhaps not just illegalities, but atrocities and crimes against humanity and those kinds of crimes. So I think this way of looking at ethics versus legality is useful, because if we're here at SIPA, Kent program, we're really trying to develop leaders who are ethical and whose ethics can stay the course despite the institutions that they will work in actually deviating from a legal course. And in that regard, I think it's tremendously difficult. I think it's much easier to discuss ethics and to investigate ethics than to be ethical at the point of contact. And that point of contact, if you had a terrorist attack, as we did in Kenya, at Westgate Mall or at Garissa University College, and you had a job that I did, and you go and you have to see the bodies, the children, they're brutalized by an enemy, then the first thing you feel is incredible rage and bloodlust. You want someone to pay. Well, will you follow through? Will the institution that you represent allow you to follow through on these instincts and these feelings you have? That's before your ethical frame even gets involved. So you want the institution to be able to say, it doesn't matter what you feel, you have to work in this way. And so I found that to be exceptionally difficult. It's something you have to hope that the institution holds you back. And then when it doesn't, you have to hope that you have the right stuff, as they say here in America, to be able to push back and say, well, I know my boss wants me to do this, but it's outside my ability to do that and be ethical. And then you then have to be ready to pay the price for that.
Well, thank you. And I think we want to come back. You touched upon issues of human agency and individual responsibility. And also, this has been discussed many times when it comes to new technology. Joel, if I can turn to you, and I know the council's been doing a lot of thinking around ethics and AI in particular. You have a whole track, a whole program on this. Could you also speak to some of the ethical dimensions, that are relevant to these new technologies? And whether, ethics can be used to promote a positive use of these technologies.
Right. No, thank you for that. And thank you for those answers, which were really quite moving. Maybe I can move that conversation a little bit into the work that Carnegie's doing in this space. And one of our concerns is just sort of the changing locus for ethics, where we find the sort of the ability to make decisions based on values and based on principles. So, Martin, you were talking mostly about sort of, states or state institutions right now. And as we look at conflict as it's happening right now, we see a move from the power being in the hands of the state in traditional ways that we think about use of military force, and migrating perhaps quickly to private sector, where you have enormous power in different institutions and in different hands, which creates a sort of a set of questions about how that's going to be managed. And then also, I believe you've already gotten into some of this in the panel discussions before, but just the whole question of human agency and where that's going, where the decision-making actually happens. And are we going to cross a line where it's taken out of the hands of individuals and put into the algorithm, as it were? And then, lastly, this is sort of this question of, where the sort of energy is for what Martin was just talking about, this sort of human-centered, humanitarian principles that I think most of us recognize as being in some jeopardy right now. Where do we find that, and how do we reinforce it?
Thank you. Before I move on to the second question again, if Izumi or Martin, you want to respond, I think Izumi in particular, if I can just build on what Joel said, the importance of other actors now. I mean, for us at the UN, we deal with member states. In your world of disarmament affairs now, you've seen obviously the rising power of private companies. How does that change the UN's approach? Even the discourse around ethics is also something that is being done or can be done with those private actors, is something that resonates with them.
Well, it's one of the biggest issues, and it has implications from different dimensions, right? I mean, one is that, when it comes to the sort of responsibility or the accountability of, autonomous weapon systems, or let's call it machines, deciding to take human life, who is responsible or accountable for that action? Is it the programmer of that autonomous weapons programs? Is it the operator? Is it the military commander who has decided to engage such a military machinery? Or is it someone who actually pushed the button to actually activate that machine? So there's a whole range of unclear elements related to the use, engagement and the use of such autonomous weapon systems. So there is that dimensions. And of course, I think there is the broader sort of human conscious. You talked about human agency, but where is the issue of human dignity in all of these? Now, machines have to be operated on the basis of data. So what are the sort of private sectors who holds the data? What's the responsibility of the private sector in all of those cycles of a machine-based weapon system being used? Now, in terms of multilateral discussions to try and craft norms, UN is an intergovernmental entity, platform. And while we talk about so-called multi-stakeholder engagements, the decisions obviously will have to be taken by governments at the UN level. So what will be the proper or appropriate engagements by private sector? Without their engagements, we don't believe that we'll be able to actually make, effective norms. So there are different kinds of implications that are really putting the question of sort of existing in traditional intergovernmental international cooperation. And then we need to make sure that there is a way forward to effectively control and regulate those weapon systems, including making the effective norms development.
Thank you. And I want to come back to the issue of norms. Martin, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to come in briefly on that. If there's something, the war in Ukraine is one of the things that it's revealing, is that when a major war it takes long enough, the sort of autonomous, the fancy technology goes away, and you get the same old, big bombs dropped by big bombers over targets indiscriminately. So yes, there's certainly going to be a lot of scope for the ethics of AI and autonomous systems, but I think we need to figure, where were we before? And I was trying to remember, there's a famous study about the willingness of soldiers to kill other soldiers, where they look at the lethality of the Civil War, First World War and Second World War. So they calculate sort of the amount of ammunition expended and the enemy dead. And they found that in the Civil War here in the US, First World War and Second World War, soldiers are incredibly reluctant to kill other soldiers directly at that point. Then they changed the training and the lethality has gone way higher. And so when a soldier was given a bayonet, they preferred to use a club, the club rather than the stab. They would aim away from the person that they're supposed to be shooting at. But the artillery didn't do that because the responsibility was diffused. So the person aiming, the person loading, the person giving the direction to fire are different. So none of them feels responsible for the results. So artillery is a lot more lethal, was a lot more lethal. Now, I think there've been some changes. So the same sort of ethical questions, I think, remain sort of drift from artillery to autonomous systems and sort of AI-driven systems. Once human beings don't feel directly responsible for the particular consequence, the ethical burden drops very, very sharply. And that appears to be almost something that's hardwired in our brains. So the question is, how is there a form of training that ups the ethical consciousness and sensitivity despite distance? Or do you ultimately need to create such strong legal measurements, not just norms, but legal prohibitions to certain actions? And that's a question. I don't have an answer to it.
No, and thank you for that, because my next question was indeed about the normative framework or the legal framework. And so starting obviously with the UN Charter, but not just, do you believe that we're properly equipped as is? Or do you think, to your point, Martin, there should be new instruments, new legal instruments, new normative frameworks established to define those ethical boundaries, to strengthen them, well, to indeed define and strengthen them, to address some of these consequences of these new technologies, where humans feel less and less responsible for deaths, for example. Joel, do you want to start? And then,
yeah, I could take a start at it. I mean, if you look at this historically, the answer is yes. Whenever you see a technological advancement, particularly in conflict, you see a normative response. that goes in the direction of restraint. So, just the history of going back to the American Civil War and the Lieber Codes, which is around the same time as the original Geneva Conventions. These were the result of the beginnings of industrial war, with Martin, as you were describing it. We now have artillery and big bombs and all this. We need to have some kind of normative restraint, and you can follow that all the way up through the Hague Conventions, through World War I, poison gas, et cetera, et cetera. So it would seem to me intuitively we should be at kind of a similar moment right now, where we have technological innovation and it's being used in war. And certainly a moment where we should be asking ourselves, will there be a similar kind of normative response that would suggest new kinds of restraints, new rules, new norms, new laws? That's a question. But I think this is a question this generation is going to face.
Yeah, and it's also a good question for you, Izumi and Martin, from your perspective. Do you see the potential for that? Because these are great historical references, but one could argue it was a very different world. Did you have at the time the same level of mistrust? Maybe you did. It's not as if today is the only time in history where we had distrust, but I think there's a bit of skepticism in some of the conversations we heard this week about, is the state of international cooperation what it should be to be able to get to that consensus around norms? Izumi and then Marc.
We certainly do hope so. I mean, but before that, I would definitely say that UN Charter applies still regardless of the domains or the technologies. I mean, it is one of the foundations for international law. But this said, as you said, on the basis of existing international law, the international community has also been, making tremendous amounts of efforts to create new norms and new legally binding instruments in this field. There are several, more recent examples, especially in the context of a CCW, Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons, which is a humanitarian framework treaty, to prohibit or regulate certain kinds of weapon systems that will be disproportionate. It will give, disproportionate inhumane sufferings to humans. So there have been actually accumulating efforts to further develop norms, and then also taking, negotiation processes to come up with a new legally binding instruments. So I definitely do hope, the UN really hopes that we will have such efforts leading to, and as soon as possible, leading to a legally binding instrument, especially in the field of autonomous weapon systems. International cooperation, the distrust is really increasing, and very, very difficult environment. But I think the key is that if all states, especially big military powers, actually understand and share the sense of risk, then there is a good possibility to arrive at such new legally binding instruments. I mean, NPT, it's in the nuclear field, and it's in entirely different kinds of technology, but that was born in the height of a Cold War, and precisely because of the shared sense of risk. So we definitely hope that it will be a possibility even in a current difficult environment.
Well, I want to play devil's advocate a little bit, but Joel, it seems like you wanted to respond, and then Marc.
No, I was just a simple point, maybe self-evident, but Izumi's point is really well taken, which is there's some sense of, yes, there's a normative agreement, but there's some sense of enlightened self-interest among the great powers, right? So why are the Geneva Conventions, why do they have currency or standing? Well, there's some degree of reciprocity implied and sort of mutual self-interest. So I think when we talk about ethics, we should be comfortable in talking about interests. In addition to, ethics is not separate from power or from interests, but we have to think of these elements together. Martin?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the things I'm going to look forward to, and I'm looking forward to recovering from my PR life, is to discuss the role of the individual more. As a diplomat, I spoke about states, and I almost spoke about them like they were people. But in fact, states are not people. States are unfeeling, uncaring entities. They really are. They're neither here nor, you know. So we depend on individuals to a remarkable degree. We depend on individuals to animate these institutions. And without individuals who have the character and the ethical orientation, we rarely meet the norms that states are supposed to meet. And so I think one of the things we have to constantly, I think, try and ask, and I think this is what is being asked at SIPA and elsewhere at NYU, where I'll be spending a lot of time, is what kind of people are we feeding into these institutions that then sit around the table? And I think we should be feeding young people who can be disobedient to authority. You know, if you, you know, when I was a college student, I demonstrated at the drop of a hat. I mean, if there was a demonstration, I wanted
let's not go there. Not here, not now.
No, I wanted to be in it. And I think that fed through in my a sort of weird disobedience I've had all my life in my work. And I think we need more. In fact, I think I'm too conformist. And we need to find ways to allow young people to question authority, to understand that us adults are really putting on a show that we know what's going on, but really we rarely do. We're just following power. And this doesn't sound like ethics, international affairs, but ultimately these young people will be the PRs. And you want a PR, if they're sitting on the Security Council, who knows what plenipotentiary and extraordinary means and can say, today I am making a stand. Capital tells me this, I find myself unable to do that. And then you have to do what you have to do with capital, which, by the way, people do. But you have to have that orientation. So the schools that are feeding the international system with its diplomats, in its international civil servants, I think really need to take a really deep look at who they're bringing up, who they're admitting into the school. Is it the all A, I will tick every box from the time I'll, or is it, a little swervy, a little curvy? And when you do that, maybe the institutions will graduate people who enter the Kenyan Foreign Ministry, the State Department here, who are willing to stand up when the moment needs people to stand up. Because I've been struck by how many horrific things have been happening, and people in positions of power are just unable to respond as individuals.
Izumi?
Just a very short point here. Ethics, or let's call it for now, responsibility as human beings, has to actually cut across all stages of weapons, not just when a soldier is, facing a moment of deciding whether or not he or she should employ that weapon. But when it comes to autonomous weapon systems, etc., it has to actually cut through the life cycle of weapons development, from the design, data collection, development, and deployment, and the engagement, use of the weapon system. So, we have a project called Responsible Innovation, and that's exactly to engage young scientists and engineers to make sure that they actually exercise their ethical or responsible thinking towards human beings when they are innovating. And I think it's a really critical concept that we need to now integrate into disarmament and arms control as well throughout the life cycle.
That's really interesting, and I know, Joel, you want to respond to that. I would just say that there's a great podcast from the National Constitution Center where Marc Rottenberg from I can't remember where he's from, but did speak exactly to that. Can we inject ethics from the very beginning into the design of these new technologies, not just the use? A lot of the conversation is about the use, and that's where the conversation with the private sector, or the academic world, the scientific world. We had two scientists who came in on Tuesday to talk about biotech, and they were saying that even in some of the leading research institutions in the United States, there's very little discussion about ethics in the research phase of these technologies. So I just wanted to bring that, and thank you also for raising that issue. Joe?
Just very quickly, just on that point, there's been their countries are selling weapon systems that they can switch off, right, remotely, and they can decide that what you're doing with the weapons is unethical, and that in a way is part of that sort of design. But I think there needs to be more thinking of the reviews, because I know as member states that are trying to purchase these weapons really worry about this, because they feel that this will be a political trigger by the selling country rather than a trigger to sort of be ethical. So how those work institutionally in terms of regulations, I think would really be a useful place to look at.
Thank you. Joe?
Yeah, just building on Izumi's point, one of the observations I wanted to share with you coming into this conversation, has to do with the systems that are getting much more challenging from this ethics perspective. We're finding ourselves embedded in systems, and I'll talk about the sort of weapon systems for now, but we can see it in our daily lives as well. I read an article recently in the Journal of the U.S. Army War College by Robert Sparrow and Adam Henchy, commended to you, and it's called Minotaurs, Not Centaurs, and it's building on Paul Charest's arguments about the development of new technologies as it relates to new weapon systems. He calls it centaur warfighting. What he means by this is the centaur is a mythological creature with a human head, right, and an animal body. So the idea being that you have systems that are called so-called decision support systems, right? So they're supposed to help the commanding authority to do their work. Well, he says that's the wrong way to look at it. Really, what we're developing now are minotaurs, which is the opposite in some ways of the centaur, right? It has the beast's head in the human body. So in other words, the algorithm is actually running the show. It's not a decision support system, it's a decision-making system. So good examples just in private life is, Uber in a way, in some ways, right? The sort of the algorithm runs the show, right? And the drivers do the work. Or if you think about the Amazon fulfillment center, right? The drivers report to, they get their instructions from the algorithm, and then they go about doing their work. Well, you can see how this extrapolates out into the potential of security, conflict, and so on. So it just gets to the point, I think, Martin, your point, Izumi, your point is really they build on each other, which is, yes, we're individuals. I think we're all sort of struggling with this notion of human agency. We want human-centered technology in all of our life. We don't want the technology to be running away from us. So I do think we're at a moment right now where we could be slipping from decision support systems that are being developed to decision-making systems. And that creates all kinds of questions, I think, for ethical leadership.
And I think that's why the language and the framing are important. I've heard some people say, we're framing it wrong. We talk about bringing humans into the loop. It should be the other way around. Bring AI into the human loop when and if necessary. So I think, yeah, the framing is important. Can I just go back to the issue of just international cooperation on these issues? Because you brought up some historical references to show that humanity was able at times to come together and find new norms in response to new challenges. But some could argue, and this is a bit of my devil's advocate point, what will it take to get us there? In some cases, humanity got together after major disasters at the cost of millions of lives. Is this what it will take in the current environment, some major catastrophe? The scientists, remember on Tuesday who came, they said, we're a bit disappointed because even on the pandemic, we're not learning. So will it take a major catastrophe for member states to come together and build a new normative architecture that is suited for these new technologies. So how do you see this?
I hope not. That would be most unfortunate. And I think definitely where I sit, I see a huge development of momentum in terms of the understanding by vast majority of member states that this is absolutely urgent, and they have to actually launch negotiations for legally binding instrument when it comes to autonomous weapon systems. Now, I fully agree with you. I said in a recent huge meeting that took place in Vienna, organized by, hosted by Austrian government on the autonomous weapon systems. I said that there are slightly different languages being used. One is humans in the loop, meaningful human control or oversight. We need to make sure that we articulate this concept, and our preference obviously is that we always be in the driving seat decision point, rather than we, the humans, being integrated into the machine's loop. So it's really the reverse. So we need to make sure that big military powers be really pushed to come to a joint, as I said, a joint assessment and appreciation of the potential risks of such a catastrophe. If we waited until some major incident were to happen, I think it would be really unfortunate. So let's use the vast majority of voices really developing at the UN and multilateral formats. So the key is just a handful of big military powers to be pushed to the table.
Yeah, and that's Joel, your point also about not having an ethical discussion in isolation of self-interest, power, because or else it'll be rather useless.
Well, I'd be very curious when we get to the discussion what people think about this, because sadly, I think the answer is you're asking the right question, and I don't have a good answer to that, which really troubles me. And I try to look for other examples, but you're right. I mean, generally speaking, it's in response to something catastrophic. So I think the only answer that I have right now is really trying to think about these challenges in the language of interest, especially among the powerful, right? So whether it's pandemic or climate or migration, I mean, we have these emerging tech. I mean, these are all very present, not abstract issues, and there are real interests at stake. So I hope that there will be a new generation of diplomats who can use the language of values and interests to make some progress on these issues. And listen, a normative framework is just a normative framework. It's not going to necessarily govern, but I believe that those norms really do matter, and they do influence behavior.
And Martin?
Yeah, it's a worrisome area. And one of the worries I have is, on one hand, we are very busy trying to close the digital divide because we see the opportunities there in digital globally. But at the same time, many of these weapons will interact with data collected about people, that not by militaries, but by commercial companies. And so we're in a way pushing people into vulnerability by forms of surveillance that can then be used to deploy weapons. So I think it's really important for us to, one, even as we push for ethical development of AI and ethical development of these technologies, we open up how many centers are developing them around the world. We help states, especially states that are relatively behind the curve when it comes to these technologies, to really have strong privacy laws and guarantees for their citizens. Because in a way, all of us are being sucked into a technological universe in which very few of our countries and companies have any sway. So when I was at the National Counterterrorism Center, I used to spend a relatively good amount of time trying to convince YouTube why to take down one video or the other. And YouTube's answer used to be, well, no, according to American law, This is perfectly legal. So I think we really need to help those countries to build up their privacy and to also build up an awareness of the coming future in terms of protecting their citizens.
Wonderful, and it's actually a nice segue because that was going to be my last question before we open it up to the audience. And I know you're still recovering from your previous capacity, so I hate to take you back to that, Martin. But you did, in your previous capacity, you did speak eloquently about some of the power imbalances around the world, and the issue of equality. And so my question to you, but also I'd love to hear from Izumi and Joel, is whether these technologies, because we've been talking here about the extent to which they exacerbate inequality or can they reduce inequality, would really be interested in your thoughts on that, on the impact on power imbalances around the world. But you already in your previous comment, you started alluding to that. But any other thoughts? And then Izumi and Joel, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, well, not to get, I know you need our replies to be terse. When we were growing up, if any of you are close to my age, you will remember that during the World Cups, football, soccer World Cups, there always used to be a surprise player, like an unknown superstar. No one knew this person. And then all of a sudden they say he's the best player or he's one of the best players in the world. This doesn't happen anymore because the professional leagues have become so good at scouting. So if you're really, really good and you live in Senegal, in a village in Senegal, Real Madrid probably knows about you. The same is happening with tech companies, right? As they get better and better at recruiting, if you're a really good programmer and engineer in Kisumu in Kenya, one day Google will know about you, and you won't even have to leave your town. You'll just work for them. So the development of companies and technologies in the so-called global south is going to have to compete with this really huge competition from these massive and amazing companies. So how we are able to build an entrepreneurial environment that allows more young people to go into engineering or building companies in Kenya, in South Africa, elsewhere, is really a huge job we have. And that has a lot to do with how we bring the private sector into it, how we show them the opportunities in these countries. Because ultimately, if you're not developing this technology yourself, you're going to be left far, far behind. And you may not have the tens of billions that a Google does, but you need to be at least a year or 2 years behind when you can spend a few millions and still sort of can see where they're going. And I think the UN should have an agency, if not an exclusive agency, at least one of the agencies that is exclusively dedicated to making sure that it's not just a digital divide that's closing, but it's an entrepreneurial divide and it's an innovation divide in the so-called global south.
Great, thank you. Shall we, or Izumi, do you want to?
Yeah. Building on what you said, in terms of what we really need to make sure now is that the digital divide will be closed, and the draft of the global digital compacts that the member states are negotiating now is very much on the basis of that understanding. I'm personally convinced that post 2030 agenda, the development agenda, really will need to be centered around technology, what kind of access that we will have and how we will be able to harness the benefits of those technologies for the global good and development. So that's one thing. The second, more in the sort of military security domain, I think what we really need to spread understanding is that the way in which we fight wars will change. And I think there is still not a sufficient level of understanding of that. I mean, while today still in Ukraine, how many battle tanks you might have will determine the military balance on the ground, etc. In the future, as you said, it's also up to what kind of a data set that you will have, what kind of private sector entities that might feed the weapon systems with the data that they might have, etc. So the whole war fighting landscape is likely to really change, and then we need to anticipate predict these kinds of changes and then go ahead of the curve and making sure that we would not be used by the technology and the data, but the humans will actually be using the data and the technology. So that's what we have to do now. Unless we start now, it will be too late because the technologies are developing so fast. So that's the urgency. My third point, my final point, is that, yes, normative developments, legally binding instruments in different separate areas, it's hugely important, but we need to have a broader governance framework for artificial intelligence and other areas, which is why the Secretary General made that recommendation in the context of a new agenda for peace. I think there are some increasing level of understandings that it is indeed really important. There seem to be some divisions in terms of where such a discussion should take place. We argue that it has to be taking place at the United Nations because that is the only universal, global, international, multilateral organizations.
So thank you. And Joe?
Just really briefly, I think tying digital divide, warfighting, and governance together, just going back to the simple point I was making before about how powers migrated from the state to the private sector. Digital divide. I mean, the incentives of the private sector are much different than the incentives of the state. It's being driven by the market. So there's going to be obvious consequences to that. In warfighting as well, you talk about Ukraine, major players in Ukraine, Palantir, you know, and listen to Andrew Karp talk about the role that this company is. It's a company. Or we all know about Starlink and Elon Musk, right? I mean, these are like major players in the middle of a very traditional, in fact, almost antiquated in some ways, military conflict. So something is really shifting there. And I think it makes your point, Izumi, just about the need for states to you know, assert themselves at this moment against these sort of private sector. You know, this growing power of the private sector it's quite visible.
Wonderful. All right, thank you for all that. Let's open it up for questions from the audience. Cons, if I could just ask you to introduce yourself when you take the floor. Let's go in this order. We have two here, and then we'll move.
Yes, good morning. Thank you very much. Paul from the UN. I had a question about journalists, humanitarian workers, doctors. It's becoming increasingly dangerous for these professions in conflict situations. There's very limited accountability. We always hear about the aid workers getting killed or the journalists getting killed, never about the states being accountable for it. So do you have any thoughts on this, on the ethics involved? And do we need new discussions on this topic? Thank you.
Should we take a few? Is that okay? I think there's another Dub right here just to keep. We'll take 3, 4.
Yeah, thank you very much. Kavish from the Permanent Mission of the Netherlands. I wanted to build on a point made by USG Nakamitsu and also by Ambassador Kimani. What are some of the lessons as young diplomats that we might need to relearn from the Cold War, in the sense that in a very fractious international environment, we still could agree to a degree of arms control, whether it's, I mean, this was the nuclear era, of course. Now we're talking about AI and all sorts of other technologies, and that was, I'd say, probably enlightened self-interest, but also probably driven by fear and also by ethical considerations. I think there's a lot of research about nuclear submarine commanders after they've received vague instructions, basically would they actually pull the trigger, animated indeed by individuals who have ethical considerations on that front. For us as diplomats, what are lessons perhaps that we should learn or relearn from that era, if any at all?
Thank you. And then up here.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm Julia from the Permanent Mission of Austria here at the UN. I do have a question, but I wanted to touch upon what we just heard, because as you have rightly said, during the Cold War, we managed to get an agreement about nuclear non-proliferation. We as humanity decided that this is an ethical threat, but it took us still decades to go on to actually prohibit the use of those weapons, to get it into a treaty. But it's still interesting to think about that example, that probably from an ethical point of view, the use of such weapons has always been the norm, that we don't want to do that again. Like, even if it's out there, even if we have it for security reasons, the norm and the ethical concerns have still been out there, and they still are there, that the use is almost unthinkable today. And what you discussed on the autonomous weapon system, like, hopefully we don't need to see their use in a horrible way before we can get to a norm. And what the Vienna conference has shown, 144 states were there. It seems that we're starting to understand the threat that's coming from the risk and the willingness to actually move forward. So let's see how that goes. But the question I had was on the power of the private sector. And I've heard in different discussions that when we talk about AI and new technologies, we've basically given so much power at this stage to a very few companies worldwide. There are different technology companies, but when you look at it, really, there are like 4 or 5 companies in Silicon Valley that can tremendously influence the access to data, the access to speech, free speech, and we've just discussed how hate speech can influence a conflict, and all those things. So in terms of ethics and the future of power dynamics, are we already too late? Have you already given a lot of our power estates to the private sector? And how can we bring them back? Because the decisions we make at the UN are still member states' decisions.
Thank you. Shall we first answer them? There's and thanks for the first question. It's Protection of Civilian Week at the UN, so I think that's also driven by that. And I think it ties with your point, Martin, about the fact that it's almost ethically easier to commit some of these crimes because there's less and less direct responsibility. So protection of civilian, the private sector, and the lessons from the Cold War. Who wants to start? Izumi?
Okay, the first question, I think we do have a very clear international legal framework. So what we really need to work on is the implementation of that legal principles. Accountability has to be pursued. As a former aid worker myself, those are really key questions. Now, the international community has been grappling with this for many years. But I think in the recent Gaza crisis have actually proven that the international community is also coming together to really realize how important it is to make sure that IHL is upheld. And in the field of disarmament as well, the EUPA, the political declaration on the protection of civilians from use of those wide effect explosive weapons in wide area effect. So there are increasing awareness and actions also being taken, and we need to make sure that implementation of IHL is really vigorously pursued. Historical lessons from the Cold War. Everyone talks about Reagan-Gorbachev when it comes to nuclear, but the example that I've started to use in recent months is actually Kennedy-Khrushchev, immediately after the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. That was a moment when, I guess we could say we were lucky because the international order was relatively more simple with the bipolar structures, but also we had Kennedy and Khrushchev who were able to come to a shared understanding of the risk and took the courage and adopted an engagement policy, and within a year they were able to agree on partial nuclear test ban treaty in 1963. And it's interesting to read what Kennedy said to the Senate when he was trying to sell that treaty for ratification in the Senate. You know, this treaty is much more useful for the American, the US national security rather than unlimited arms race. So I think we need to have that sort of a, understanding at the leadership level. I think the key word really is courage, and this is a leadership program. You know, I think this really points to some of your concerns about how, as young diplomats, you can actually exercise that sort of a courage and make sure that cool heads will prevail in your national policy structures. We will actually course correct in the current rather worrying security environments. The private sector, we have been talking about it quite a lot. The picture is quite complex, actually. You know, there are, of course, big tech companies that are really dominating also in the normative, international normative conversations, and they tend to be, of course, US, Western European companies. So as the UN, we also want to make sure that the tech companies from the global south will be involved in that kind of discussions. But at the same time, it's interesting to see that those mega companies are a little bit more leaning forward to have a stronger norm so that they will have a level playing field between those big companies that actually do care about perceptions rather than startups. So the picture amongst the private sector entities are also quite complicated and complex. But we need to make sure that, again, you know, we have really make sure that everyone in the private sector, but going beyond the engineers, etc., will have a strong sense of ethics and responsibility in innovation and also in their business.
Thank you. Yeah, Martin, I think Izumi's calls for courage kind of echoes your call for the audience to call to disobedience.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Well, as an African, we didn't have a Cold War. It was a hot war. And so the stability, so-called stability of the Cold War was not stable at all. It was lethal and terrible for our democratic aspirations. So you can learn first not to adopt the framing of the most powerful. What they call stability is rarely stability. And as a young diplomat, you need to be able to question that. You also, too many of the honors and glory go to the higher ups in the system. We need a system that that raises and recognizes young diplomats who do the right thing, and they are there. I don't know how those should be set up, but countries should think of setting them up. Thirdly, don't be too wedded to your job. It's okay to leave. I'm actually discovering it's actually, you can do it. Because it's very hard to enter an ethical mindset for yourself and still hope for a really long career. In fact, the moment you do that, you need to shorten your horizon and say, you never know, right? And so keep in touch with Jean-Marie and these guys, you know, just in case you need to send your resume out. And I think that comes to the second issue again of the accountability of this terrible, terrible trend all around the world. Journalists and humanitarians are not just incidental, they're being targeted directly. And I think as young diplomats, you're going to be sitting on desks that make decisions about funding, about different things that your government commits to. And you need to use that opportunity. You won't always get your way, but I think you need to use that opportunity to say, no, there needs to be accountability. And if there's not going to be legal accountability in that country for those people or in an international setting, then we as a department, we as a delegation, at least let's us try and create some form of accountability where we can. And a lot of that is the work of experts and young upcoming diplomats, then those people like me maybe will not go your way, but you need to do your part. And so it's to again encourage you, as Nakamitsu was saying, it's not to become some sort of rebel, revolutionary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That's not a good environment for that. But it's to always know that you have agency, that you have the ability to change events, and that you need to find your spot, and you're smart enough to do it. And in fact, you are obliged to, because just because the PRs and the ministers are not, doesn't let you off the hook. I don't know if that's a bit unfair, but that's it.
Thank you. Joel?
That's great, Marc. No, it reminds me of the old saying, you lead from where you are, right? Everybody has a role, no matter where they are in the system. Right? Just very quickly, you said it so well, but just on the humanitarian aspects, journalists, aid workers, and so on. Again, it just goes back to the history, right? One of the sort of founding moments is, founding of the ICRC, right? It's this idea of, having some space for humanitarian imperatives in war. I mean, it's sort of the fundamental principle. So it's there. I think it's a question of empowering that principle and finding ways to empower it. On the Cold War, that's a great example. By the way, just a footnote, just on Kennedy, I think you're right. One of the great peace speeches is given in this time frame. It's the very famous speech of June 1963, Kennedy's speech at American University, where he describes peace, but he does it in very pragmatic, realistic, sort of using the language of interests in that speech. It's quite a moving speech. It's short. I commend it to you. You can either read it or watch it on YouTube in black and white. It's quite moving. But also the Cold War example, we can find all kinds of examples. One that I've been looking at most recently is the 1967 Treaty on Outer Space, partly because it's so threatened right now. But think about it, 1967, not a good time for international norms to be agreed upon in some significant way. So sadly, we're revisiting this right now for other reasons, but I think it's proof that even in very difficult times, normative agreement is possible. And finally, just quickly on the private sector, is a very big, complex issue, but I would just boil it down to something is wrong. I'll give you this sort of an American answer to this, but when the Pentagon needs to call Elon Musk for operational assistance in Ukraine, something's off, right? So whatever it takes to fix that problem, whether that's a contracting problem or some kind of governance problem, I think it needs to be addressed quickly.
I was going to encourage, being in the UN made me realize that many countries live under superpower umbrellas, and they get collected and then aimed in some direction. And sometimes the collusion, it's okay if the government also wants to do it. I think we're going to need to have a diplomacy that really recognizes value in relationship between smaller powers, middle powers, and to try and make efforts to build bridges in different ways that build up the possibilities of collaboration in a deeper and more far-reaching way. So yes, you may be in the so-called West or in Europe. I call it so-called because Global South is also so-called. But it's so tremendously important for a country like Kenya to be able to sit with the Netherlands and have a real meeting of minds. We all have our interests, we have our alliances, we have our neighborhoods, but we have to do a lot more than we've been doing in the past to really listen to each other and try and forge ways to work with each other across regions. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Good show of hands. Just, I know we're supposed to close in 5. Is it okay if we close for our panelists to close 10 minutes later, 11:55? That'll give you 5 minutes to stretch your legs, and then we'll move on to the second. So very quick comments or questions. Dove, I think we have 3, 4, and then but we will need to close at 11:55.
Thanks a lot. This has been a very interesting discussion. Basile Bogas from the Belgian mission. I always like to link these types of discussions around ethics to very concrete examples and maybe also questions about how to deal with this. And I was particularly inspired by some of the comments from the ambassador on being courageous enough to disobey or to question things. It makes me think about what happened in the State Department when Trump was elected president, and a number of high-profile diplomats and government officials quit. You know, at least from where I was sitting, that did not seem to change the policy outcome. And in fact, some of the ways in which part of the politics did not lead to terrible outcomes on the ground is because there were lots of people that stayed on the inside and tried to kind of maybe correct some of the, to the extent they could, some of the instructions coming down from the top. So interested in your view on, you know, when do you call it quits and leave, keep a short time horizon, be ethical, and what can you do from the inside? And then, you know, we're at Columbia, it's Friday. I want to ask a difficult question and then see if I can sow some discord. But we've had a very concrete case of people speaking up because they had ethical concerns with the use of modern of AI applications in conflict, and that was Gaza, and that was just next door. I mean, that to a degree is what we would like to see, right? People speaking up and people trying to call for attention in the ways that they can. Obviously, also not without its troubles, as we saw sort of 200 feet from here. You know, what's your take on how that situation was handled, and how should that go forward?
Thank you. All right, just two more and very brief, please. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Shizuru Horiba from the Japanese mission. I truly agree the importance to create an ethical education and social system. But at the same time, I'm also facing the difficulty to implement it in the sense that it very takes time and especially difficult in a conflict situation. So my question would be that I know that it's very depends on the country too, but in your experience, which stage of the conflict should such efforts to building up the ethical education and social system start, and how can that happen on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you. And I think actually two more, but I need you to be very, very succinct. Thank you.
Thank you. Ethics, objective, subjective, intersubjective. It's a matter of agreement, and there's increasingly less and less agreement on what is right, what is wrong, on what the norms are in our disjointed world. And so my question to you is, international courts and international justice institutions, differently mandated, ICC, ICJ, what's your take on their role in our moral and political universe right now, and whether there can be a case made for them serving as a moral compass and maybe metaphorically carrying us through these dark ages that we're living through now?
And the last question. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eder Rojas from the Mission of Peru. I thank you very much to all the panelists. So we were discussing this idea of like not having to pass through a major tragedy for deciding to put restrictions in some weapons that are developed with these new technologies. And we also brought up the example of the USA and the USSR, like deciding to agree on a treaty regarding nuclear weapons. So is there any, but when it comes to laws, and we mentioned Vienna and 144 countries, but I guess that's none of the countries that are engaging for laws are those countries that host companies with the capacity to produce laws. And it was mentioned that we need to push the military powers to those agreements. So are there any examples in history where those countries that are not part of the big military powers being able to push the military powers into an agreements? Because the problem I see with the example of Kennedy and Khrushchev is that, again, they were able to get into an agreement because it was two of the military powers with direct interest, and not because they were pushed by other countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Who wants to start? And just to if you want to add your kind of final thoughts along with your answers. Thank you.
Well, it's not always to my brother here from Belgium. It's not always the right thing to quit or the right thing to stay. It's really your reading of the situation and you doing the best you can. And certainly there are those who do stay who make a considerable difference positively. So quitting and sometimes very good, sometimes it's not. It's depending on you. But I think as different ministries, we can take a lead from the American book and perhaps push for each of our ministries to have good dissent channels that allow, I know Kenya, sorry, Gideon, we don't have a dissent channel. You know, if you dissent, that's up to you. So I like that dissent channel. It does create something. In terms of when do you bring in ethics into the process, one of the things I hope to do at CIC is to get back into peace building and try and clarify different parts of peace building more clearly. And so to see where does that sit, when, how is it sequenced? How do you shape it, and what's the best way to deliver it? So it's really work that I hope to do, and feel very free to reach out when I'm at CIC. I don't have too much to say in conclusion. I think I've spoken a lot, but it's only really to thank you so much, and Jean-Marie and the rest of you for the invitation. Thank you.
And be careful what you ask for in terms of guidance. A lot of people may come to you for career guidance. Izumi and then Joe.
Yes, a lot of questions. The use of those autonomous weapons supported potentially by data sets, etc., in the current conflict in Gaza. Now, I mean, I say at the beginning that UN does not have any independent ability to assess the accuracy of those reports. But one thing that is for sure is that while the laws discussions until about last year, 2 years ago, all states actually said that this is a future weapons, in Vienna, there was an acute sense that it's just around the corner. It's happening. So I think definitely it added to the sense of urgency of a vast majority of member states. At the moment, these autonomous weapon systems being used apparently in Gaza conflict is not fully autonomous in the sense that it's a decision support entity. There are a couple of issues there. One, is it reliable? Number two, also, it is about the kinds of decisions and standards and regulations of military behaviors that is being decided. I mean, the permissible collateral number, apparently for the junior operative of Hamas is between 15 and 20, and the senior operatives up to 100. And in comparison, when the US forces went for Saddam Hussein, it was 30. So there is that issue of how you define military operations and permissible collateral damage. So definitely there is that human agency that you can still control the use of those weapon systems. But that's the current. We don't know tomorrow and day after tomorrow. The sense of urgency is definitely there. I would like to say that you can't just talk about ethical behaviors in a conflict. As I said, I think it really has to happen across the board in many different, sort of corners of the society. I would like to see, especially university level educations in general, to become more interdisciplinary in science and, STEM fields. I had a lecture at the Indian Institute of Technology where I talked to AI researchers about IHL. They had never heard of IHL, and then they actually said themselves it would be really useful that if the UN were to actually launch courses about international humanitarian law. It's not a UN's work, but in any educational sectors, I would like to see more interdisciplinary education so that when it comes to the conflict, there will be more ethical considerations. ICJ ICC. Today, there was a big announcement by ruling by ICJ. I think it is definitely part of the international system. ICJ in the UN mechanism, ICC as an independent criminal court, international criminal court, is now really beginning to play a huge role in the ethical consideration. Of course, it's a legal, it's a judiciary organs, but I think the decisions, rulings by those courts will be a very, very important one. Many, I think, historical examples of smaller states actually influencing course of events. I remind ourselves that NPT, the original idea came from a small nation of Ireland, GA resolution. Landmines, also a group of like-minded states, now becoming a very important, very strong international law. It's not universal yet. So there are examples in the history where smaller states got together and influenced the course of events. So that's it.
No, thank you very much. And Joel, the last word to you.
Yeah, just to close it out, what an honor to be on this panel with you two. And you, Marc, thank you. And Jean-Marie, thank you for convening. It's very important. Just 2 words on ethics. I usually try to begin my remarks with this, but I'll end with it. I think we all have to remember the virtue of humility. It's just essential to any discussion of ethics. I think right now we're in a moment of sort of competing moral certitudes. And I think some degree of empathy, humility, and you're all diplomats trying to see it from somebody else's point of view, is really essential. And this point about quitting, staying, or whatever, ethics is about trade-offs, right? There's never sort of a right answer once and for all. You make a decision, then there's another decision to come right after it, right? So I think thinking about ethics as an ongoing, iterative, never-ending process, I hope should be helpful to you as you think about being an ethical leader. Sure, there are moments, there are threshold moments, but generally speaking, it's a series of decisions over a period of time. Try to establish your North Star, work toward it. It's never going to be perfect. And don't kid yourself that your decision is going to change the policy for all time, for everybody, right? I mean, you play a role, and it's good to have some healthy perspective on that. It should empower you. It shouldn't hold you back, but it's good to have some sort of global understanding of all that. So I hope these comments have been helpful.
Great. Thank you so much. Wonderful way to close. And please join me in thanking Martin, Izumi, and Joel for this panel. Thank you so much.